It's hard at times, because you're waiting to be put to death. So that kind of breaks a little part of you every day. Kind of breaks you every day. And sometimes I have to catch myself, for being overwhelmed and stressed out, and like force myself to eat, because it does that to you where you just don't want to do nothing.
February 7th, 2024. A cold Wednesday evening inside Huntsville State Penitentiary. Behind thick concrete walls and iron doors, a man lies strapped to a gurney. His wrist secured. His breathing slow. He knows this is it. A faint metallic click, guards checking restraints. The steady beep of a heart monitor. A small crowd watches from behind glass. Among them, his wife, Helene Noah Dubois. She lifts a white service dog to the window, one last comfort before the inevitable. A slight pause. Then, the voice of Steven Lawayne Nelson, steady and resigned. It is what it is. He tells her to live her life. To be happy. He looks at the warden. I'm not scared. I'm at peace. And then, his final words. Let's ride, warden. But how did we get here? Who was Steven Lawayne Nelson? Who was the man whose life he took? And what really happened on that day inside a small church in Arlington, Texas? On the morning of March 3, 2011, the doors of North Point Baptist Church stood closed, just like any other day. Inside, the air was still, unsettlingly quiet. But as the hours passed, that silence became something else. A warning. By the afternoon, concern had turned to fear. Calls to the church went unanswered. And when church members arrived, what they found inside would haunt them forever. Reverend Clint Dobson was just 28 years old. A young pastor, full of faith, full of life. He wasn't the kind of leader who stayed behind the pulpit. He was hands-on, dedicated, always reaching out to the people who needed him the most. To his congregation, he wasn't just a preacher. He was a friend, a mentor, a guiding light. But that day, Clint Dobson wasn't standing at the front of his church, delivering a sermon. He wasn't greeting his community with a warm smile or offering words of hope. He was on the floor, beaten, strangled, suffocated with a plastic bag. Beside him, another victim, Judy Elliott, 67 years old, the church secretary. Unlike Clint, she was still alive, but just barely. Her face was swollen, bruised. Her injuries so severe, investigators later said it was a miracle she survived at all. The sanctuary, the place meant to be a refuge, had become a crime scene. The signs of struggle were everywhere. Papers scattered. Furniture overturned. Bloodstains on the floor. And something else. Something investigators immediately took note of. Missing items. A laptop. Credit cards. Car keys. Whatever had happened inside that church, it hadn't just been an act of violence. It had been a robbery. But this wasn't random. This was personal. This was brutal. This was rage. Word spread fast. North Point Baptist wasn't just a church, it was a cornerstone of the Arlington community. People gathered outside, desperate for answers, struggling to understand how a place of worship could become the scene of something so horrific. But for Clint Dobson's family, for his friends, there was no understanding. There was only loss. And one question. Who would do this? And why? Long before Steven Lawayne Nelson found himself strapped to a gurney inside Huntsville State Penitentiary, before he walked into North Point Baptist Church on March 3, 2011, before he took a life, his path had already been set. A road paved with chaos, crime, and choices that led him straight to that moment. His story doesn't start in the execution chamber. It starts decades earlier, with a little boy who had already begun making his way into the system before he even understood what that meant. By the time Steven Nelson was 6 years old, he had already been arrested. A child, barely out of kindergarten, already standing in front of police officers. Most kids that age are learning to read, riding bikes, playing in their backyards. But for Steven, childhood was different. It wasn't just one mistake or one bad day. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. As he got older, the crimes escalated. Small infractions turned into serious offenses. Assault. A growing rap sheet that told the story of a young man who couldn't, or wouldn't, pull himself away from trouble. By high school, he had dropped out completely. No structure. No real direction. Just a cycle of arrests and short stints behind bars. But it wasn't just petty crimes. It was violence. Fights that ended with people in the hospital. Drugs that blurred the lines between survival and self-destruction. And no one stopped him. Or maybe by then no one could. By the time he reached his 20s, Steven Nelson wasn't just another troubled young man. He was a threat. He had already been in and out of jail, already known to law enforcement. But nothing he had done before compared to what would happen on that day inside North Point Baptist Church. So how did he end up there? What brought him to that church, to that crime, to that moment that would define the rest of his life? Some say it was just another robbery gone wrong. Others believe he knew exactly what he was doing. But one thing is certain, on March 3, 2011, Steven Lawayne Nelson made a choice. And that choice changed everything. March 3, 2011. A quiet afternoon at North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Inside, Reverend Clint Dobson and Church Secretary Judy Elliott went about their day, completely unaware that the next few moments would become their last together. That soon, their church, meant to be a sanctuary, would become a crime scene. Sometime in the early afternoon, the front doors swung open. Steven Lawayne Nelson stepped inside. What happened next was fast. Violent. Ruthless. Reverend Clint Dobson was young, strong, but he never stood a chance. The attack was sudden, overwhelming. He was beaten with such force that his injuries were described as catastrophic. But that wasn't enough. He was strangled, his airways crushed under the pressure of hands that had no intention of letting go. And when that still wasn't enough, a plastic bag was pulled over his head. Cut off from air, from life, from any hope of survival. Judy Elliott, the church secretary, was next. She was 67 years old. She wasn't a threat, wasn't trying to fight back. But mercy wasn't a part of this attack. She was beaten, relentlessly, brutally. Blows that left her face shattered, her body broken. And yet, somehow, she survived. By the time Steven Nelson left that church, Reverend Clint Dobson was gone. Judy Elliott was barely clinging to life. And the sanctuary they had dedicated their days to had become a scene of unthinkable violence. Blood on the floors. Overturned furniture. Signs of a struggle so intense that investigators later said it looked like a fight for survival, one that Clint Dobson lost. But why? Why this church? Why these victims? According to Steven Nelson, it was never supposed to be like this. He claimed he was just a lookout, that two other men were responsible for what happened inside North Point Baptist that day. But the evidence, the hard, undeniable evidence, told a very different story. Security cameras from surrounding businesses placed Nelson in the area. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime. And then there were the stolen items. Reverend Dobson's laptop. The church secretary's car keys and credit cards. Things that shouldn't have been in Nelson's possession, but were. The robbery was clear. But this wasn't just about stolen belongings. It was about what happened inside those church walls. The brutality. The sheer violence. The kind of attack that wasn't just about money. It was about rage. Control. And in the end, it left a pastor dead, a woman fighting to survive, and a community forever changed. In the days following the brutal attack at North Point Baptist Church, Arlington police were faced with a crime that sent shockwaves through the community. A pastor murdered. A church secretary barely alive. A place of worship now forever marked by violence. But one question remained: who was responsible? And how could investigators prove it? Clint Dobson and Judy Elliott had been targeted. The evidence was clear: this wasn't a random break-in. It was intentional. And whoever had done it had walked away with more than just stolen items. They had walked away believing they would never be caught. But they were wrong. March 4, 2011. Just one day after the attack, Arlington police arrested 31-year-old Steven Lawayne Nelson. The pieces were already starting to fall into place. In his possession? Reverend Dobson's laptop. Judy Elliott's car keys. Credit cards that had once belonged to the victims. Evidence so damning, it left little room for doubt. But that wasn't all. Witnesses placed Nelson at the scene, before and after the attack. He had been spotted driving Judy Elliott's stolen car. And surveillance footage from nearby businesses confirmed what investigators already suspected. Nelson wasn't just connected to the crime. He was at the center of it. But even with a mountain of evidence, Nelson refused to take responsibility.
My name is Steven Nelson. I'm here on Polonsky in the Death Row, and I've been here 13 years. I'm here for capital murder. I was with 2 other people, and I'm here for law parties. If you was the lookout or the getaway driver, you still get the same punishment as somebody who killed the person, the victim. What I want to let the world know that I'm an improved man being executed for a crime, a murder that I did not commit, when all DNA and legal proofs have proved that I didn't kill anybody. And that the judicial system here in America, in Texas, needs to be really...
When the case went to trial in 2012, he had a different story to tell. He claimed he was only a lookout. That 2 other men he refused to name, were the real killers. He insisted he had nothing to do with the brutal beating, with the suffocation, with the sheer violence that had taken place inside that church. But there was a problem. His story didn't match the evidence. It didn't match the surveillance footage. It didn't match the DNA left behind. And most importantly, it didn't match the injuries that Clint Dobson and Judy Elliott had suffered. This wasn't the work of multiple people. It was the work of one man, Steven Lawayne Nelson. For the jury, the decision was clear. After reviewing the evidence, the witness testimonies, and Nelson's own statements, they reached their verdict. Guilty. Capital murder. The sentence? The justice had been served. But for Clint Dobson's family, for his congregation, and for the people who had loved him, it didn't bring him back. The wounds remained. The loss was permanent. And for Steven Lawayne Nelson, the countdown had begun. A countdown to the day he would face his own fate. February 7, 2024. Huntsville, Texas. The walls of the state penitentiary have seen countless final moments, heard the last words of men and women whose fates were sealed long before they ever stepped inside this room. And tonight, another name is added to that list, Steven Lawayne Nelson. For 13 years, Nelson sat on death row. 13 years of appeals, of delays, of waiting. But now time had run out. The doors to the execution chamber opened, and he was led inside, strapped to the gurney. His arms stretched out, his body secured. The cold reality of what was about to happen sinking in. There was no escaping this moment. No more arguments to be made. No more stories to tell. Beyond the glass, witnesses gathered. Some were there for justice. Some for closure. And one woman stood apart, Helene Noah Dubois, the wife he had married just 2 weeks earlier. She was allowed to bring a single companion into the witness area, a small, white service dog. As she held it up to the window, it was the closest she would ever get to him again. With the IVs in place, the execution team asked if he had any last words. Nelson turned toward his wife. His voice was calm, unshaken. It is what it is. He thanked her, told her to enjoy life. And then, as if he had already made peace with what was coming, he said the words that would be the last he ever spoke. I'm not scared. I'm at peace. Let's ride, Warden. At exactly 6:50 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. The drugs flowed through his veins, slowing his breath, stilling his body. Within minutes, it was over. The pronouncement was made. Steven Lawayne Nelson was dead. A life that had begun with trouble, spiraled into violence, and ended in a room filled with quiet observers. The story of Steven Nelson, of Clint Dobson, of the lives shattered by one afternoon in March of 2011, had reached its final chapter. With the execution of Steven Lawayne Nelson, the case was officially closed. But for those left behind, closure is never that simple. A life was taken. A community was shattered. And the scars of that day would never fully fade. For the Dobson family, the pain never truly went away. Clint was more than a victim. He was a son, a husband, a friend. A man whose life was built on faith, on kindness, on the belief that people could be saved. But in the end, it was that very kindness that was met with unimaginable cruelty. Judy Elliott survived that day. But survival doesn't mean escaping unharmed. She carried the trauma of that attack for the rest of her life. The memories of that afternoon, the terror, the helplessness, it never left her. A place that had once been filled with prayer and peace had become the setting of her worst nightmare. Justice was served. A trial was held. A sentence was carried out. But did it truly bring justice? Or was it simply the final step in a cycle of violence that had begun long before Clint Dobson ever met Steven Nelson? The execution marked the end of the legal battle. But for those who knew and loved Clint Dobson, for the people who had once sat in the pews of North Point Baptist Church, the story would never really be over.